Albert Pierrepoint never raised his voice. He never threatened, never bragged, never showed the slightest tremor in his hands. And yet, more than 400 people took their final breath in his presence. By day, he was an ordinary grocer. By night, Britain's most efficient, most trusted, and most feared executioner. He believed in silence over spectacle, precision over brutality, mercy in the very place where mercy was supposed to end. But behind that calm exterior lived a man wrestling with a truth he could barely admit, even to himself: that the machine he served might be wrong. That justice was not as simple as a rope and a calculation, and that no execution, no matter how humane, could ever truly prevent the crimes that created it. Tonight, we step into the life of a man who lived at the edge of morality, a man who escorted hundreds to death, only to discover that the system he upheld was built on an illusion. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let the noise of the day fall away. And if you enjoy these journeys into the hidden corners of history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the stories waiting in the shadows. Now, we begin. Chapter 1. Early Life. Albert Pierrepoint entered the world on March 30th, 1905, in the quiet industrial village of Clayton, nestled in the West Riding of Yorkshire. He was the third of 5 children and the eldest son of Henry Pierrepoint and his wife, Mary Buxton. Life in the Pierrepoint household was rarely easy. Henry drifted between jobs: apprentice butcher, clogmaker, mill porter, each position short-lived, each paycheck uncertain. And when work was thin, the heavy shadow of Henry's drinking only deepened the family's financial struggles. Yet Henry carried a secret profession, one hidden behind ordinary labor and long nights at the pub. Since 1901, his name had appeared on the official list of executioners. It was not a stable post. Executioners were paid per hanging, with no salary, no pension, no guarantees. But it brought a strange kind of purpose. That purpose vanished in 1910, when Henry was struck from the list after arriving drunk at a prison the night before an execution and berating his assistant far beyond what the authorities could tolerate. Henry's brother, Thomas, stepped into the role in 1906, becoming a fully qualified executioner himself. But young Albert knew nothing of this unusual family trade until 1916, when a newspaper published Henry's memoir. The truth startled him, yet it also stirred something. At school, when asked what he wished to be when he grew up, Albert wrote with firm conviction, "When I leave school, I want to become an executioner like my father. It takes a steady man with skilled hands like my father and Uncle Tom, and I shall be the same." In 1917, the family left Huddersfield and moved to Failsworth near Oldham, Lancashire. Henry's health was failing, and he could no longer take on physical work. To help support the family, Albert left school and took a job at the local Marlborough Mill. When Henry died in 1922, he left Albert 2 blue exercise books, his handwritten account of his life as an executioner, and his execution diary, detailing every hanging he had ever taken part in. Through the 1920s, Albert moved on from mill work, becoming a delivery driver for a wholesale grocer, taking orders from a traveling salesman. By 1930, he had learned to drive both cars and lorries, rising steadily until he became manager of the business. Quiet beginnings, shaped by hardship, and by a legacy that waited patiently for him to step into its shadow. Chapter 2. The Assistant Executioner, 1931 to 1940. In the spring of 1931, a young Albert Pierrepoint sat quietly at his desk, pen in hand, and wrote a letter that would, in time, shape the course of his life. On April 19th, he applied to the prison commissioners for the position of Assistant Executioner. At first, the response was discouraging. There were no vacancies. But life, as it often does, had a way of opening doors at the most unexpected moments. 6 months later, a reply arrived, inviting him to London for an interview. Albert travelled to the city, nerves taut yet steady, and passed the interview. He was sent to Pentonville Prison for 4 days of training, though training hardly described what awaited him. There were no lectures, no textbooks. Instead, he faced a weighted dummy suspended from a beam, which he would repeatedly hoist, adjust, and lower. Every motion had to be exact, every calculation precise. And yet, perhaps more importantly, the work demanded emotional stillness, a calm presence in the shadow of death. By late September 1932, Albert received official confirmation. He was now an assistant executioner. The work paid £1, 11 shillings and sixpence per execution. It was modest, yet meaningful for a working man of the era. A second payment, equal in value, could follow, but only if his conduct remained proper, discreet, and unerring. Discretion was not merely encouraged, it was codified. Albert was reminded that his behaviour before, during, and after the execution must remain beyond reproach. He must avoid drawing public attention, and he must never reveal the details of his work to anyone. His first assignment arrived in December 1932, and it was outside England, in Ireland. His uncle Tom, a respected state executioner, had been engaged by the Free State government to hang Patrick McDermott, a young farmer who had murdered his brother. Because the case lay beyond English jurisdiction, Tom was free to select his own assistant. He chose Albert. Together, uncle and nephew travelled to Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. The execution was scheduled for 8 a.m, and like most Albert would witness, it lasted less than a minute. Albert's responsibilities were straightforward, yet exacting. Escort the prisoner to the scaffold, bind his legs, step back, and allow the chief executioner to perform the final act. Each step required care, precision, and a stillness that could not be rushed. Throughout the 1930s, Albert led a double life. By day, he worked in the grocer's trade, delivering goods and managing orders. By night, or whenever duty called, he was an apprentice to his uncle, absorbing the discipline, solemnity, and quiet professionalism that defined Tom's approach. He admired his uncle's calm demeanour and the principle that no task should ever be performed under the influence of whiskey. Lessons in precision, patience, and respect for the condemned became the foundation of Albert's philosophy, one he would carry for the rest of his life. In July 1940, Albert assisted in one of the most famous cases of the era, the execution of Udham Singh, the Indian revolutionary who had assassinated Sir Michael O'Dwyer. The night before the hanging, the newly promoted chief executioner, Stanley Cross, struggled with the complex calculations for Singh's drop. Albert, steady and confident, offered clear measurements. His precision and calm judgment were noted by those present. Shortly thereafter, Albert Pierrepoint's name was added to the official list of chief executioners. The young man who had once followed his uncle to Dublin had stepped out of Tom's shadow and into his own. A new chapter of responsibility, precision, and moral weight had begun. Though the work was grim, it was approached with the same careful attention, solemnity, and humanity that Albert had learned in his apprenticeship, qualities that would define him for decades to come.
Chapter 3. Chief Executioner, 1941. In October of 1941, Albert Pierrepoint stepped fully into the role he had long trained for. His first execution as chief executioner was that of Antonio "Babe" Mancini, a gangster convicted of murder. The task was solemn, methodical, and performed with the same quiet precision that had defined the men who came before him. The Home Office had strict procedures, and Albert followed them with unwavering discipline. He and his assistant arrived the day before the execution. There, the governor informed him of the prisoner's height and weight, details that mattered more than anyone outside the job might ever imagine. Through the narrow Judas hole in the cell door, Albert observed the prisoner's posture and build, noting every physical detail he would need for the next morning. Then came Albert's private preparation. He walked to the execution chamber, usually just a few steps from the condemned cell, and examined every piece of equipment. A weighted sack, matching the prisoner's weight as closely as possible, was hung from the rope. The drop was calculated using the official Home Office drop tables, a precise system designed to ensure a quick and humane death by breaking the neck instantly. If needed, he adjusted the rope and allowed the weight to stretch it overnight, so no twist or slack would disturb the final moment. At dawn, all was ready. At exactly 8 a.m., Pierrepoint, his assistant, and 2 prison officers entered the condemned man's cell. With calm, practiced hands, Albert bound the prisoner's arms behind his back with a leather strap. Moments later, the small group moved through a second door into the execution chamber. The steps that followed were swift and deliberate. The prisoner was positioned on a marked spot over the trapdoor. A white hood was placed gently over his head. The noose settled around his neck, the metal eye positioned just under the left jaw, so that when the trap fell, the head would snap back and the spine would break cleanly. And then, with a firm pull of the lever, the trap opened. From the moment Albert entered the prisoner's cell to the final drop took no more than 12 seconds. 12 seconds of quiet precision, ending a life with the same swift consistency every time. The neck broke in nearly the exact same place, execution after execution. This was the cold efficiency that defined the career of Britain's most famous executioner, a man whose every motion was measured, controlled, and carried out in absolute silence.
Chapter 4. War Shadows, 1941 to 1949. When the world slipped into the darkness of the Second World War, Albert Pierrepoint's work entered a realm more shadowed and morally complex than he had ever known. For years, he had labored quietly behind prison walls, an unseen figure carrying out the final duty of the British state. But now, with nations in flames and loyalties shattering across continents, the gallows became another front line. One fought in silence, in narrow corridors, in the final breaths of men judged too dangerous to be left alive. By the war's end, Albert would become not only Britain's most experienced executioner, but the central figure in some of the most dramatic, chaotic, and historically consequential hangings in modern history. Between 1941 and 1945, Albert carried out the sentences on 15 German spies, men who had entered Britain quietly, posing as civilians, only to be unmasked as agents of the Third Reich. He also executed several US soldiers condemned by American military courts stationed on British soil. The work was grim, heavy, and deeply secret.
Even among prison officers, few knew the details of what happened behind the thick wooden doors of the execution chamber. And yet, the war kept assigning him new shadows to face. New names, new stories, new outcomes decided by courts, but fulfilled by his hands. The most dramatic of these wartime executions came in December of 1941, when Albert received orders to proceed to Wandsworth Prison. His task? To hang Karel Richter, a captured German agent whose final minutes would become the most violent struggle of Albert's entire career. On the morning of the execution, everything seemed ordinary. Albert moved through the familiar rituals, the check of the rope, the calculation of the drop, the silent walk toward the condemned cell. But when he stepped through the doorway, the world erupted. Richter, wild-eyed and desperate, lunged to his feet, shoving a prison guard aside with unexpected strength. Before anyone could reach him, he hurled himself head-first into the stone wall. The crack of impact echoed down the corridor. He staggered back, dazed but standing, blood trickling, breath ragged, like a man half awake in a nightmare. A furious struggle followed. Albert managed to secure the leather strap around the spy's wrists, only for Richter to tear it apart, ripping the eyelets free with brute panic. Another fight broke out. This time, the strap held. Guards forced him forward, half carried, half dragged, toward the gallows. Even with his legs bound, Richter attempted one final act of defiance. He jumped. Just as Albert pulled the lever, the prisoner launched himself upward, throwing off the precise alignment Albert had carefully planned. The noose slipped slightly, catching not under the jaw, but beneath the nose. And yet, despite the misalignment, the break was instantaneous. The prison doctor confirmed death at once.
Albert rarely held on to souvenirs of his work, but the torn leather strap, the one ripped apart in the struggle, was given to him as a memento. He kept it for years, using it only in executions he considered of special significance. In his later memoir, he would reflect with stark honesty, "It was the hardest execution of my career on the scaffold." Amid these turbulent years, Albert found a bright patch of personal peace. In August of 1943, after a 5-year relationship built on quiet companionship, he married Anne Fletcher. His occupation, Britain's chief executioner, was something he had kept carefully hidden from her. But just days after the wedding, he received an urgent call to travel to Gibraltar to carry out the execution of 2 saboteurs. When he returned, he knew the time had come to tell the truth. Anne listened in silence. Then she simply nodded. She already knew. Rumors, she said, had circulated in the community long before their marriage. Albert would later write that her acceptance steadied him through the darkest years of his career. The war ended, but Albert's heaviest duties were still ahead. After the British liberated the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, hundreds of guards, doctors, and administrators were arrested and tried for crimes against humanity. In late 1945, Albert was ordered to Hamelin prison in Germany to carry out the sentences on 11 convicted Belsen staff members, as well as 2 German war criminals responsible for murdering an RAF pilot. Publicity was the thing Albert hated most, and yet he found himself thrust into the spotlight. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery publicly announced that Britain's executioner would be travelling to Germany. Reporters followed him across the airfield as he boarded the plane. "I felt not welcomed," he later wrote, "but hunted, like a public executioner for a crowd." On December 13th, 1945, he executed the Belsen staff. The women first, then 2 men at a time. But this was only the beginning. Between December 1948
and October 1949, Albert carried out 226 executions in Germany alone, sometimes more than 10 in a single day, 17 across 2 days. His precision, speed, and attention to detail made him, in effect, the executioner who closed the chapter on many of the war's darkest perpetrators. Only 6 days after the Belsen executions, Albert returned to London for a series of historically defining hangings. First came John Amory, the fervent Nazi sympathizer who tried to recruit British POWs into a legion fighting for Hitler. Amory pleaded guilty to treason, making his trial the shortest for such a crime in British history. On January 3, 1946, Albert executed William Joyce, the infamous broadcaster known as Lord Haw Haw. Joyce's case was legally complex. He had American birth and only tangential British citizenship, but his propaganda efforts made him one of the most despised voices of the war.
The next day, Albert hanged Theodore Church, the last man executed in Britain for treason, and the final person in the nation's history to be executed for any crime other than murder. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered in the execution chamber long after the guns fell silent. In September 1946, the British government sent Albert to Graz, Austria, to train local prison staff in the long drop method. Austria had previously used short drop hangings, which caused slow, torturous strangulation. Albert demonstrated 4 double executions, with trainees assisting. Given his expertise, many expected him to oversee the executions of the major Nazi leaders after the Nuremberg trials. But the responsibility was handed instead to U.S. Army Sergeant John C. Woods, whose inexperience led to infamous errors. Wilhelm Keitel, suffering a slow death, taking 20 minutes. Trapdoors too narrow for the drop. Prisoners hitting their faces as they fell. When the Albert never criticized Woods publicly, he didn't have to. The contrast spoke for itself. Chapter 5. Post-war hangings. When the roar of war finally faded and Europe began to stitch itself back together, Albert Pierrepoint stepped slowly out of the shadows of military prisons and returned to a quieter life. He left behind his job in the delivery trade and took over the lease of a small public house in Oldham, Help the Poor Struggler, a humble pub on Manchester Road. To the people who walked through its doors, he was simply Albert behind the bar, the friendly landlord who poured them ale and listened to their troubles. Few knew what he did when the phone rang unexpectedly at night. Fewer still had any idea that the man polishing glasses behind the counter was Britain's most experienced executioner. In the early 1950s, Albert left the Struggler and moved to a larger establishment, the Rose and Crown in Much Hoole near Preston. Reflecting later in life, he explained why he chose this path. I wanted to be self-employed so that I could never be held up for time off. I could fly back from Dublin after an execution at 3 o'clock and open the bar at 5:30 without anyone questioning where I'd been. It was a strange, dual existence. Landlord to the living, final escort to the condemned. In 1948, as Britain emerged from rationing, rubble and wartime grief, Parliament turned its attention to a different kind of rebuilding, the justice system. A new criminal justice bill was introduced, forcing the nation to ask a question that had simmered for decades. Should the death penalty continue? While members of Parliament argued, no executions were carried out. The gallows was silent, and for the first time in years, Albert's only duty was pouring drinks at the Rose and Crown. But the bill failed in the House of Lords. After 9 months of stillness, the executions resumed.
A year later, in 1949, Home Secretary Tutor Ede formed a royal commission to investigate whether capital punishment had a place in the modern world. Albert himself was summoned to give evidence. In November 1950, he travelled to Wandsworth Prison to conduct a demonstration, a full mock hanging for the members of the committee. The commission's final report was published in 1953 and eventually led to the Homicide Act of 1957, which narrowed the grounds for execution by distinguishing between capital and non-capital murder. But long before the law changed, Albert continued his grim duties that brought him face to face with some of the most infamous killers of the era. In August 1949, Albert carried out one of the most widely reported executions of the post-war years, the hanging of John George Haigh, better known to the public as the acid bath murderer. Haigh had dissolved the bodies of his victims in sulfuric acid, believing that without a corpse he could not be convicted of murder. But he misunderstood the law and the science. He confessed to 9 killings, though only 6 could be proven.
Hoping to avoid the rope, he claimed he had drunk the blood of his victims, attempting to establish insanity. The jury did not believe him. Albert met him on the gallows at Wandsworth, and with that, one of Britain's most chilling murder cases came to an end. Only a year later, Albert faced a far more personal burden. In 1950, he executed James Corbett, a frequent customer at his pub. The two often sang duets together. Albert called him Tish, and Corbett affectionately replied with Tosh. But alcohol, jealousy, and rage led Corbett to murder the woman he loved. Albert later reflected on the haunting irony of the situation. There could be no better deterrent to murder than that very chap, Tish, singing duets with me in the Help the Poor struggler, knowing the noose was never far from where he stood, and knowing the man who held it stood beside him. But deterrent did not work. He killed the one he loved. And so, Albert led his friend to the scaffold. It was one of the few executions that left a lasting mark on him. In March 1950, Albert executed Timothy Evans, a 25-year-old with the vocabulary of a 14-year-old and the mental age of a child. Evans was convicted of murdering his wife and baby daughter at 10 Rillington Place in London. His statements to the police were inconsistent, sometimes claiming guilt, other times protesting innocence. The jury convicted him of killing his daughter. 3 years later, the truth surfaced in the most horrifying way. The family's landlord, John Christie, was arrested for murdering several women. Christie confessed to killing Evans's wife, though he denied murdering the child. Albert executed Christie in 1953 at Pentonville Prison. But the damage was done. Evans's case became one of the most infamous miscarriages of justice in British history, one that would fuel the growing movement against the death penalty. Only months before Christie's execution, Albert carried out one of the most debated hangings of the 20th century, that of Derek Bentley, a 19-year-old with significantly impaired intelligence. Bentley and a 16-year-old accomplice, Christopher Craig, had attempted a burglary. During the police confrontation, Craig shot and killed an officer. Bentley had already been arrested. He was under police control when the fatal shot was fired. The prosecution argued that Bentley had encouraged Craig with the words, "Let him have it, Chris." Did he mean shoot him or give him the gun? Craig, too young for execution, was sentenced to imprisonment. Bentley, tried as an adult, was sentenced to death under the doctrine of joint enterprise. Albert did what the law required. But decades later, Bentley's conviction would be quashed, a posthumous recognition that justice had gone deeply wrong.
Perhaps no case captured the nation's attention like that of Ruth Ellis, executed in July 1955. Glamorous, volatile, and deeply troubled, she was locked in an abusive relationship with racing driver David Blakely.
After days of sleeplessness, panic, and emotional collapse, fueled by heavy drinking and sedatives, Ellis confronted Blakely and shot him 4 times. She showed no denial, no excuses. The nation exploded with debate. Newspapers pleaded for mercy. A petition with 50,000 signatures reached the Home Secretary. The cabinet discussed the case at length, but the sentence remained. Ellis became the last woman ever executed in Britain. Just 2 weeks after Ellis's death, Albert carried out his last execution. Norman Green, who had confessed to murdering 2 young boys near Wigan. The execution was routine, without controversy. But for Albert, something had changed. The weight of the job, the public scrutiny, and the evolving morality of the age had all begun to press upon him. When he walked away from the scaffold that day, he stepped away for good. It was the end of a career that had shaped the final chapter of Britain's era of capital punishment. Chapter 6. Albert Pierrepoint's retirement and final years. As the winter of 1956 settled over England, Albert Pierrepoint found himself standing once again before the cold stone walls of a prison in Manchester. The air was sharp, the corridors silent, and the snow outside fell in thick, slow flakes, as if time itself had paused to watch him work. After years of perfecting the craft few dared to understand, and even fewer wished to speak of, Albert approached each assignment with the same unwavering ritual. Precise calculations, careful knots, and a mind fixed on duty rather than judgment. That January afternoon, he spent hours inside the execution chamber, measuring the height, adjusting the rope, and ensuring every detail aligned with the exact science he had mastered. Yet fate had its own plan. As evening drew near, word arrived. The prisoner had been granted a last-minute reprieve. Albert's work, for once, was not required. Outside, the snowfall had grown heavy, smothering the roads in white. With no choice but to wait out the storm, he booked a modest room in a nearby hotel. It was a rare moment of quiet for a man whose life had been marked by the weight of final moments. Quiet enough for him to wonder, perhaps, how long he would continue down this path. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. It contained reimbursement for his travel, but not for the execution fee, since no execution had taken place. Albert, accustomed to clear procedures and long-standing custom, wrote back to the prison commissioners, explaining that in previous reprieves he had been compensated in full. He had incurred costs. After all, someone had to tend his bar in his absence. But the reply he received was cold, procedural. The commissioners insisted that payment for a reprieved prisoner was not their responsibility. He should speak to the sheriff, they said, and they reminded him firmly that an executioner was paid only for the act itself, nothing more. Shortly afterward, the sheriff offered a modest compromise. £4, a token payment. A gesture, but not one Albert felt reflected the duty he had carried for decades. On February 23, 1956, Albert Pierrepoint wrote a final letter. He announced his immediate resignation, requesting that his name be removed from the official list of executioners. And just like that, the most renowned executioner in modern British history laid down his rope. Of course, newspapers leapt at the story. Rumours swirled that his resignation was tied to the execution of Ruth Ellis,
the last woman hanged in Britain. Albert would later deny this with characteristic clarity. There had been no incident, no horror, nothing unusual that day, he wrote. Ruth Ellis had spoken no final words, and he had not resigned because of her. His autobiography offered no explanation either. The prison commissioners had asked him to keep the true circumstances private, and he honored that request.
Even when the Home Office stepped in, pressuring publishers, considering legal action under the Official Secrets Act, the mystery of his departure remained sealed. After stepping away from the gallows, Albert returned to the quiet life he and his wife had built around their pub. They ran it together for many years, pouring pints, greeting customers, and offering warmth instead of judgment. In the 1960s, they eventually retired to the seaside town of Southport, where the air smelled of salt, and the waves carried a gentler rhythm than the ticking clocks of prison corridors. In 1974, Albert finally told his story in his book, Executioner, Pierrepoint. There he reflected not on fear or notoriety, but on the human spirit, on duty, mercy, and the strange intersection of law and life. It was a softer voice than the world expected from a man with his reputation. Albert Pierrepoint lived out his final years in quiet dignity. On July 10, 1992, at the age of 87, he passed away in the care home where he had spent his last 4 years. A man who had seen more final moments than anyone should, yet who ended his own days in peace. And as the lights dim on this chapter of history, perhaps we are reminded that even figures cast in shadow have stories whispered in gentler tones. Stories that ask us to think, to reflect, and to rest with understanding, not fear. Chapter 7. Albert Pierrepoint's changing view on the death penalty. By the time Albert Pierrepoint settled into the quiet years of retirement, the weight of his life's work lingered with him like a shadow that stretched across decades. For many years, he had been the final figure countless men and women saw before stepping into eternity. He had carried out his duty without hesitation, believing, as many did, that justice demanded such a final act, and that society depended on it. But time has a way of softening even the sharpest certainties. In 1974, when he released his autobiography, Pierrepoint revealed something no one expected. With the same steady voice he once used to describe the precision of his craft, he confessed that he no longer believed in the very system he had served. The death penalty, he wrote, was said to be a deterrent, but he could not agree. There had been murder since the dawn of humanity, and there would be murder until its final chapter. If death truly frightened people into righteousness, he argued, then surely he would know. He had been the last face so many had seen, young men trembling but composed, women who whispered prayers, laborers hardened by life, mothers whose eyes held worlds of regret. What surprised him most was their courage as they walked toward the unknown, their bravery, their resignation, their humanity. None of it suggested fear of the gallows had stopped them in the moments that mattered. And none of it convinced him that the executions he performed had prevented even a single future crime. "I have not stopped one murder," he wrote quietly, almost sorrowfully. Not one. These words rippled across Britain, startling those who had once seen him as the embodiment of the state's final authority. How could the man who had carried out over 680 executions suddenly claim the act achieved nothing? 2 years later, in a 1976 BBC Merseyside interview, Pierrepoint's tone shifted again. Life, crime, and the world had changed, he explained. When he first wrote the book, he said, there had not been as much violence. But now,
Now he found himself questioning his own conclusions. "Honestly," he admitted, "I don't know what to think. My mind changes every day." It was a rare glimpse into the uncertainty of a man long defined by decisiveness. Yet even this ambiguity drew criticism. One of the harshest voices belonged to Sid Durnley, Pierrepoint's former assistant. In his 1989 memoir, The Hangman's Tale, Durnley expressed disbelief, almost betrayal. How, he asked, could a man who had once taken such pride in his efficiency now claim that none of it mattered? How could someone who had surpassed every executioner before him suddenly turn away from the very purpose of his life's work? To Durnley, it seemed unimaginable, perhaps even unforgivable. But history, especially when told in quiet hours, often shows us that human convictions are rarely set in stone.
They bend, shift, and evolve as people grow older, as memories settle, and as conscience whispers louder than duty. And so, Albert Pierrepoint, a figure once forged in the stark world of judgment and finality, spent his later years not as an unyielding symbol of justice, but as a man wrestling with the deepest moral questions of his age. Did he still believe in the death penalty? Did he regret his work? Or was he simply acknowledging the complexity of a world where justice and mercy constantly collide? Perhaps Pierrepoint himself never fully knew the answers. What remains is the quiet truth of a man who had seen death more intimately than most, yet ended his life searching not for power or certainty, but for understanding. And in that search, he reminds us of a timeless lesson. Even those who carry the heaviest burdens are allowed to question them. Even those who lived by harsh truths may, in the end, long for gentler ones. Chapter 8. Albert Pierrepoint, Approach and Legacy. Albert Pierrepoint often described his approach to the grim task he carried out so many times as almost sacred. In his autobiography, he used words that Lizzie Seal, a true crime scholar, described as possessing a quasi-religious language, suggesting that some higher power had chosen him for the role of executioner. When asked by the Royal Commission about his work, he said plainly, "It is sacred to me." To Pierrepoint, this sacredness was not about power or spectacle. It was about duty, dignity, and a profound moral responsibility toward the condemned. He wrote, "I have openly said my work is sacred to me. That sacredness must be expressed most clearly at the moment of death. A condemned prisoner entrusted to me, after decisions I cannot alter, is still a man or a woman who, according to the Church, is worthy of mercy. The highest mercy I can give them is to grant and preserve their dignity in death. Gentleness must be maintained." He saw himself not as a punisher, but as the last steward of humanity's fragile dignity, guiding those who had transgressed through their final moments with care, calm, and precision. Brian Bailey, a biographer of Pierrepoint, noted how the executioner's language reflected his deep personal ethic. In his autobiography, Pierrepoint wrote in a matter-of-fact tone, "I had to hang Derek Bentley. I had to execute John Christie. And I had to execute Mrs. Louisa Merrifield." Bailey observed, "He never hung anyone. He never framed it as a personal act of violence. It was a duty imposed upon him, not a choice." The exact number of people Pierrepoint executed remains a matter of debate, as records and recollections vary. Bailey and Leonora Klein, one of his biographers, placed the number above 400. Another biographer, Stephen Fielding, cites 435, based on prison execution registers maintained at the National Archives. Obituaries in The Times and The Guardian count 17 women and 433 men.
The Irish Times suggested 530 people, while The Independent noted 530 men and 20 women. The BBC summarized the figure as up to 600. Whatever the exact total, it is clear that Pierrepoint's hand was present in the final moments of hundreds of lives, each treated with the same meticulous care and measured solemnity. Pierrepoint's life and work have since been the subject of numerous biographies and studies, either focusing solely on him or exploring him alongside other executioners. Notable examples include Stephen Fielding's Pierrepoint, A Family of Executioners, 2006, and Leonora Klein's A Very English Hangman, The Life and Times of Albert Pierrepoint, 2006. He has appeared in documentaries for television and radio, and his life has inspired portrayals on stage, in films, and across literature, reflecting the enduring fascination with his complex and morally challenging profession.
When Pierrepoint retired, two of his former assistants, Jock Stewart and Harry Allen, were promoted to chief executioners. Over the following 7 years, they carried out 34 more executions in the United Kingdom. One of the final acts in this long, solemn chapter occurred on August 13, 1964, when Allen executed Gwyn Evans at Strangeways Prison in Manchester for the murder of John Allen West, while Stewart simultaneously executed Peter Allen, Evans's accomplice, at Walton Prison in Liverpool. These were the last judicial hangings in Britain. The legal landscape continued to evolve, and in 1965, the Murder, Abolition of Death Penalty Act was passed. It instituted a 5-year suspension on capital punishment, reflecting a nation beginning to question the morality and efficacy of executions. The temporary ban was made permanent on December 18, 1969, marking the end of an era in which the scaffold and the executioner were an accepted, if grim, part of the justice system. Yet, Pierrepoint's legacy is not defined solely by numbers or dates. It lives in the careful, reflective approach he took to a job most would recoil from, the attention he paid to maintaining the dignity of those condemned, and the moral introspection he embraced, even after decades on the scaffold. For Pierrepoint, hanging was never an act of personal revenge or cruelty. It was a burden of duty, approached with precision, solemnity, and, above all, humanity. In this way, he became more than a figure of execution. He became a window into the moral complexity of justice itself. The world remembers not just the sheer scale of his work, but the philosophy that underpinned it. A philosophy of care, respect, and an unwavering attention to the final moments of life, however dark they may have been. Albert Pierrepoint may have left the scaffold behind, but his story remains a haunting, thought-provoking reflection on duty, mortality, and the human capacity for both judgment and mercy. A story to ponder long after the lights dim, in the quiet hours before sleep. As we close the chapter on Albert Pierrepoint's extraordinary and haunting life, it's worth pausing to reflect. Here was a man who walked in the shadows, performing a duty that few could imagine, yet did so with a meticulous care, a quiet dignity, and an unwavering sense of responsibility. He was neither hero nor villain, simply a man who faced the final moments of hundreds of souls, always with the aim of preserving their dignity in death, even when life had been denied them. Pierrepoint's story reminds us that history is not just made by battles won or nations conquered, but by the quiet, often invisible choices of individuals. The weight of responsibility, the moral dilemmas, and the human stories behind every event can teach us more than any textbook ever could. In understanding him, we glimpse not only the man behind the executioner's mask, but also the fragility, courage, and complexity of human life itself.
If you found this story as compelling as I have, there are many more waiting for you. On this channel, we explore the echoes of history, people, places, and events that have shaped our world in ways large and small. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey into the past. And if a particular story or chapter stood out to you, leave a comment below. We love hearing which moments resonate most with you. History has a way of whispering to us, even from the darkest corners. Let's continue listening together, one story at a time. Thank you for joining me tonight, and I'll see you in the next chapter of Echoes of Greatness.